Well guys, a lot of you have been asking for a car tutorial, so that is exactly what we're going to do today. Most of you have probably seen this little yellow beetle driving into the ocean, and that is actually not the scene we're creating today. We are creating something even cooler in my opinion. So let's take a look at today's project. Before we start, I will highly recommend my Instagram, where I often post inspirational content and teasers for my new projects. With that said, let's get started. I would like to give you some important techniques that can improve you as artists and make you more independent when you're creating scenes in the future. Cause even if I showed you exactly how I did, chances are you'll still not get a good result. This is because you need to know some basic stuff about focal length, camera movement, lighting, composition and other artistic tools. So guys, let's get to it. I think you'll be very psyched to know that I'm actually giving away this scene in the description. So go down and download the .blend file and follow along this tutorial. I even created these awesome assets which you can use to get a different scene from mine and get some variation. Well, some of you might be wondering how I created this scene from the bottom, so I'm just gonna give you a quick walkthrough of how we got here, and then you can download the file in the description and follow along. I started by importing this great looking Porsche model by Carol Miklas, who has some great 3D model on his page. You should definitely check it out. They are just great in topology and they are easy to retexture because they are already UV unwrapped. I then brought the model into Blender where I did some tweaks. For example, I deleted one of the headlights, and then I brought the model into Quixel Mixer where I did the texturing. You can do the texturing in Blender as well. I just chose Quixel Mixer as I find it more easy to use. I then created a rig for the car, which is easily done with the Rigacar plugin, which is linked in the description. There are great tutorials on their webpage, which I think you should follow if you want to rig another car. I then created a path for the car, and then I snapped the car to the path using the follow path constraint. And then using the constraint offset, I created a simple keyframe animation. Then I found an asphalt texture which I liked, which I put on a plane. I snapped the plane to the car path using a curve modifier. I then used an array modifier to make the plane cover the whole car path. I then created an empty which should be the focus point for the camera. I placed it onto the car and parented it by pressing Ctrl P, parent as object. By using the Rigacar plugin, it allows me to snap the wheels of the car to the ground plane by simply selecting the ground plane in the options. Then I found this image. Did some quick and dirty modeling, Ctrl B, bevel, scale, made a new material and loaded in the image. Select all the faces, Ctrl U, cube projection, make the image fit in the UV editor. Then I selected all the weird edges and assigned a plain white material. And done with that one. So I created a cube and added in a mirror modifier. Then I did some quick modeling and added in some edge loop in the end. Select all the faces and press Ctrl T to triangulate. Then I added in a wireframe modifier and tweaked some settings. Found this image. I imported the image in Blender using the import images as planes add-on, which you can find under preferences. I then cut out the signs using the knife tool and deleted the surrounding faces. Placed the signs in the wireframe and there you go. Let's make grass! So I made a plane, scaled it on the y-axis and gave it some edge loops. Then I used proportional editing to make it look like grass. When I was happy, I duplicated it a ton of times and did some more proportional editing. Then I duplicated the whole mesh and rotated on the z-axis. It doesn't have to be perfect because this is a very small part of the scene, so let's make a material. So add in a mix node and a translucency node. We use the translucency node to allow sunlight to pass through the grass mesh. Give the grass a green color and there you go. I also duplicated the car path and made it a camera path. Then I created a camera which I snapped to the camera path using the follow path constraint as well. I also used the track 2 constraint where I picked the empty as the tracking object. Party! You're up to speed, so let's get started. So when you open up the project, it should look something like this, all pink and beautiful. And don't worry, this is just because we're missing the environment texture and we're gonna import one from HDRI. Well, the project should also include the car collection, the camera collection, the ground collection, the rig stuff collection, the lighting collection, which is empty at the moment, and the free asset collection. Well, let's jump over to HDRI where they have some great HDRs which are all free. And essentially they are just real pictures of the real world.
Photos are photoreal because they're photos.
You should pick an HDR where there is a lot of stuff far away from the camera, for example the mountains or the water. This will essentially give the feeling of a huge scene when we're rendering this out. Note that if you have a higher quality HDRI, the background will look more realistic. However, you shouldn't be using a too big of an HDRI as this will totally kill your render time. I found that 8K is the perfect amount of detail and it will still make your render time slow. The image you're looking at right now is actually 4K. Look when I changed to the 8K. It's a huge difference, it's way sharper in the background. However, the car is moving in this scene, so the background won't be that visible. So there's no need to use an even better quality HDRI. 8K is fine for this scene. But let's see what happens when I change it to 16K. Maybe you noticed the difference or maybe you didn't. The fact is that the picture is more crisp, but there's no need to use a 16K image as this will increase your render time with 20 seconds. It's simply not worth it. So download an 8K version for the render and download a 1K version when we're working in the viewport. So head over to the World tab and import your 1K HDRI. Since we will be working a lot in the viewport, you do not want to import your 8K HDRI before the final render. Maybe you have noticed that I'm actually using a 4K HDRI, but that is only for the sake of this tutorial so that it looks crisp for you guys in the viewport. If you want to change the position of your HDRI, you can head over to the shading tab and change it from object to world mode. You should only be playing around with the Z-axis rotation. If you change any of the other rotation parameters, this will totally ruin the perspective of your HDRI and it will look weird, so just don't do it, guys. So, currently this is the animation we have. However, feel free to change this. This is just a standard animation that I have created for you guys. If you want to change it, select the camera path and tap into edit mode. Then you can change how the curve looks and thereby also the animation of the camera. But now we have another problem. It looks like the car is driving on a flying road. So let's create a ground plane to cover this up. So press Shift A and create a plane. We'll snap it to the car path using a curve modifier. Select the car path, which should be named in your project. And as you can see, it's now snapped to the car path. Press GX to move the ground plane to the side. We only want the ground plane to cover one side of the road, as the other one doesn't matter because of the perspective. I'll get back to this in a moment. Now tap into edit mode and subdivide the plane a couple of times to give it some geometry to work with. By using proportional editing, you can give the plane a sort of a bend. Actually, let's subdivide it once more. I'm simply selecting the outer edges on the Z-axis and moving them down using GZ. By using proportional editing, I can create sort of a curve so it looks like a hill. I think this looks fine. So tap out of edit mode and let's see how it looks. Shade smooth? Well, this looks fine. Add an array modifier. Make sure the array modifier is above the curve modifier, otherwise this will not work. Change it so that it moves on the Y-axis instead of the Z-axis. Change the count so that it covers the whole track. Now let's take a look at the animation. Now it looks like the ground actually covers up the empty space quite good. However, it looks like it's not connected to the road, so move it up using GZ. Now this looks perfect. Well, at the moment it's all white because we haven't assigned a material yet. And before we do that, I want to give you some important advice. When you're looking for your ground material, you should find a ground material that matches your HDRI. Very often I see renders where the ground material is nothing similar to the HDRI and it looks like two different worlds. Let's say for example I used a canyon mountain material for this ground. It will look freaking ridiculous, guys. So with that in mind, let's jump over to cc0textures.com and find a free ground material. So take a look at the HDR you have chosen for your scene and find a ground material that matches it. Is there a lot of rock in your scenes? What are the features? When you pick a material, you have the option to download it in a JPEG format or PNG format. PNG carries more data information, but it's also larger in size. JPEG carries less information and is smaller in size. So if your computer is slow in general, you should pick a JPEG. If you have a fast computer, you should pick the PNG files. Since there will be a lot of motion blur in this scene, it is not important to pick a ground material with a high resolution. I went for the 4K JPEG. So import your material in Blender. Make sure that the specular is set low. Otherwise, you're gonna get an unrealistic sheen on the surface of your ground material. So if I were to render this out right now, this is what I would have. I chose a brown dirt material for my ground as I thought it matched my HDR quite well. But let's add in some variation with some grass to break up that solid brown color. So select your ground plane and go under particle settings and create a new particle system. Rename it grass. Change the mode from emitter to hair. As you can see, the grass is only emitting from our original plane and not covering the whole surface. To fix this, go into the modifier panel and apply the array modifier. Now head over to the particle settings and go under render. Change it from path to collection and choose the grass collection, which is included in the project file. Now you can play around with the number of particles in your scene. You can actually go pretty high because the grass is so low poly. I could even change it to 30,000 particles and it will still go at 30 frames per second. Even at 100,000 it isn't that bad. But I'm gonna stick with 10,000 though. Under the render tab you can change the scale. I go with 0.06 and I crank that scale randomness high up, something like 0.7, but you can go even higher. That is completely up to you. Oh, and it's very important that you remember to enable object rotation, otherwise the grass will look weird. So the grass is done, and now we want to generate a sense of speed in the scene. It's important to understand that speed is usually generated with objects moving fast in front of the camera. So the closer an object is to the camera while moving, the faster the camera appears to be traveling. So let's set something up in the foreground to give this sense of speed. I think this edge post will do the job just fine. So select the edge post and under transform, zero out the location. Then go into the modifier tab and add a curve modifier. Once again select the car path as the curve object. Press GX to move the edge post to the side. When you have positioned your edge post, scale it down so that it fits the scene. Then go under the modifier tab and add in an array modifier. Once again remember to place it above the curve modifier. and change the factor so that it moves along the y-axis instead of the x-axis. In the real world, there's actually quite some space between each edge post. So to create some distance, change the value of the y-axis. I changed it to around 100 and it looked perfect. Then just change the count so that it fits the scene. 8 worked for me. And when we render it out, it already looks much better and we get the feeling that there's more speed in the scene. Now let's talk lighting, because this might just be one of the most important things. I'm gonna tell you guys what I did with my scene, but this might vary depending on which HDR you have chosen, because this will give you a different lighting situation. But I will analyze my HDR and tell you which thoughts I have about it and what you should do in my situation. So it's very obvious that this HDR represents a very cloudy day. The shadows are very soft and the weather is quite grey. The shadows aren't really represented, neither are the highlights. This is what you will call flat lighting, and it's quite boring. This is because the eye is drawn to very high contrast areas. This could be very dark shadows or very bright highlights. But in this lighting condition, nothing is overexposed or underexposed. This means that the eye has no idea where to look, because all parts of the image are equally interesting to look at, or equally boring, some would say. So in my case, we will have to add in some additional lighting to make this image look more interesting. But depending on your HDRI, you do not necessarily have to add in any additional lighting. Some HDRs are just interesting enough in themselves. So let's improve my lighting situation. Well, under the World tab you can see the strength of your HDRI. Mine is set to 1.5, which I found looked good for this HDRI, but you should definitely try to play around with the value yourself. So I added in a sun lamp and played around with the rotation to give an interesting look. It's usually a good idea to light your subject from the side, as this will give some good looking fall off shadows and highlights. Then I played around with the strength and the angle of the sun. A higher angle will give you a softer shadow. A higher strength will give you a brighter image and a higher contrast between highlights and shadows. When you're adding additional lighting to a scene lighted by an HDRI, you should always stay true to the HDRI. So it is still a cloudy day and your sunlight will not change the background image. So let's say I crank the strength of the sunlight up to something like 50. Yes, the foreground is popping very much, but look at the background, nothing changes. It still looks like a cloudy day. So the lighting in the foreground and the background doesn't match. And this is a problem. So you have to find a middle way where you just get a little bit more out of the shadows and highlights in your HDRI. So let's add in that edge rail. So this is what the model looks like, and this is quickly how I made it. I wanted to make it fairly low poly so that it won't slow down your computers. For the UV unwrapping, I did a smart UV unwrap, and then I assigned a very basic metal texture. So guys, I think you know this by now. Zero out the location for the rail, add in a curve modifier and select the car path as the curve object. Add in an array modifier and change the relative offset from the x-axis to the y-axis. Then change the count so it fits the scene. Then you just have to position the rail and you're done. So let's talk about the camera movement. To generate a feeling of speed, you generally want to keep your camera as low as possible. In this way, the ground plane will pass faster in front of the camera, which will create a lot of motion blur and thereby speed. However, we do not want too much motion blur, because we would like to see what is actually happening in the animation. I like to keep my subject centered in the frame. In this way, it's easy to follow along the animation and see what's going on. The camera shake is controlled by the empty that is parented to the car base. You can change the amount of shake by selecting the empty and go under the graph editor. There is a noise modifier applied to the Z location and the X location. You can get a different result by playing around with the noise settings. Let's say you want to give the car a new animation. You might just tap into edit mode on the car path and move it around. But as you can see, you move all the stuff that is connected to the car path. So what you want to do is duplicate the car path, rename the new car path car animation or something like that, and assign the car to the new car path under the constraint. Now you can give the car a new animation if you want to. As you can see in the animation, the wheels are actually turning when the car is turning around a corner. This is because of the Rigacar plugin. The plugin automatically calculates when the car is moving around and bake in a keyframe simulation for this. So you should definitely go grab the Rigacar plugin, it's free in the description. When you are happy with your animation, all you have to do is select your rig, and as you can see, there is a tab for the Rigacar plugin, and then you just have to bake the steering and bake the wheel's rotation. Well, a lot of you wanted to know how I did the green screen guy in the yellow Beetle, so I'm gonna show you just that. Shoot some green screen footage and key out the actor. Export the image sequence with an alpha transparent background. Import your footage using the Import Images as Planes add-on. Place the footage in your car and press Ctrl P to parent the footage to your car. Well, of course this technique has limitations as the actor does not appear in the front view. So how do we solve this? You probably guessed it. Just shoot some footage of your actor in the front view and parent by object once again, and let him drive into the sunset. Well guys, there's still a lot of stuff that I would like to cover, but it's not gonna be in this video unfortunately. However, if you enjoyed this video, feel free to drop a like, otherwise I'll see you in the next video.